So it's time to ask the question, because you may notice that the war in Ukraine is almost never discussed or debated anymore. It's at best an ancillary issue. It's what usually happens where a huge amount of attention, public attention, is devoted to a new event. The government makes all kinds of claims and people aren't looking, and then when they go back to their lives and cease paying attention, the government just runs wild and makes what was supposed to be a temporary or controversial policy permanent. And that means that the United States basically has a free hand, the CIA, the Biden White House, to spend all of your resources as much as it wants on profiting, on generating profit for a tiny sliver of people, both in Washington and Kiev. And so we want to ask the question, not so much what are the geopolitical implications of this war, which is what we typically spend our time focusing on when we report on it, but instead, what is the actual cost for American citizens? Not just the financial cost, but the cost in quality of life and standard of living. And what prompted this question was that last night we recorded an interview with the former professor at DePaul University, Norman Finkelstein, who was denied tenure as a result of a very ugly battle in 2007 waged against him by Alan Dershowitz, primarily due to Alan Dershowitz's contempt for Norman Finkelstein's criticisms of Israel. And he's kind of become one of these people who are not metaphorically canceled, but completely destroyed. He's unemployable. He hasn't worked since then in academia. He barely appears on media outlets. And so we thought about doing a series because everybody, when they launch a show, always says, we're going to air views and voices that aren't available elsewhere. And it's well-intentioned. Most people mean it when they say it, but then they end up airing voices that are in full accord with the program, that are available in many other places. And the people who are genuinely excluded from mainstream discourse, even though they might have a lot to say, are typically ignored. We put Professor Finkelstein on our show about a month ago or 6 weeks ago when we interviewed law professor Amy Wax, who at the University of Pennsylvania Law School has her tenure threatened because of views that she defends that are quite radical about race, particularly, and about related issues. And we put Professor Finkelstein on that show to give his views on academic freedom and what the limits might be, given that he, too, lost his job in academia due to his views almost 15 years ago now. And as part of that interview, we did a wide-ranging interview with Professor Finkelstein, not just about academic freedom, but about a variety of other issues. We were interrupted by time constraints, so last night we recorded the second part of the interview, which we intend to air this week. And I asked him about his view on Ukraine, and he said something and described it in a way that is very unusual to hear, and it's what provoked my desire to spend this evening examining this question. This is what he said as part of the as of yet unaired interview.
I don't expect everybody to agree with me with my opinions on the Ukraine. The problem is there's no questioning at all. Just the other day, I recently reached Medicare age. I tried to contact Medicare. It's impossible to contact them on the phone. It's absolutely impossible. I challenge anybody to dispute me on that point. Impossible. I finally go down to the Social Security Agency. I'm talking to one of the agents. She said that you call Medicare. I said, it's impossible. I said, could you imagine we're in the 21st century. We have a dozen different forms of communication. We have telephone, we have email, we have fax, we have social media. You can't contact a basic government agency. I said to me, it nauseates me. $100 billion for the Ukraine, $100 billion for the Ukraine. And you can't provide a phone service for senior citizens.
Now, people might quibble with that anecdote, especially if you're somebody who's more well-versed on the internet. I think it's worth remembering that a lot of senior citizens spent the majority of their life without the internet even in existence. So particularly older people are not really as adept as younger people are when it comes to performing functions online. But there's certainly no denying his central point, which is that services and quality of life in the United States has degraded and is on the decline in multiple ways over the last, let's say, decade or so. And therefore, I do think it's not just a valid question, but one that ordinary people would instantly ask, which is, why when the government can't do this for me, or why when the country has deprived me of this opportunity? For example, young people can't move out of their parents' home until they're 30 or beyond in record numbers. Couples who are raising young children are often required, not just when they want, but even if they don't, both of them to work full time and then pay somebody to raise their children or care for their children during the day. All things that never were part of the American way of life, certainly for the middle class, is almost disappearing. And so, of course, it's a very reasonable and rational question to ask. Why are we sending $100 billion to Ukraine when we can't even clean up a chemical explosion in East Palestine because our government has no resources or can't get organized enough? Now, I think a lot of times media elites don't ask that question because their lives are fine. They come from wealthy families, they went to the best schools. Certainly people in Washington are overwhelmingly wealthy. Just this last week, I noted that Dianne Feinstein, the 5-term senator from the state of California, just happened to have sold one of her vacation homes for $25.5 million in Aspen that she and her husband used to entertain foreign policy elites over the past 2 decades or so. We basically are run not just by an oligarchy, but by a gerontocracy, just people in their 80s and 90s who are extremely rich. And that's who dominates media as well. People who come from multi-families, who go to East Coast schools that are private schools, and then colleges that are very prestigious. So they don't worry about things like this, and they don't think this way. But I think what you heard from Norman Finkelstein is the way that a lot of people speak. And when Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, who, whatever you think of her, is more like a kind of ordinary person in Congress than most people in Congress, because she's been a politician for about 6 seconds. She's done well in business. She's not poor by any stretch of the imagination, but she's somebody who has lived in her Georgia district for many years and was not a professional politician. And so when she stands up in Congress, she often says things that people mock because it sounds like what Norman Finkelstein said. So here was Marjorie Taylor Greene the last time Congress was asked to vote on whether we want to play this role that we're playing in the war in Ukraine, which was last May, almost 9 months ago, when the Congress took Joe Biden's request for $33 billion, arbitrarily increased it to $40 billion, and then overwhelmingly approved it, with the yes vote coming from every single Democrat in Congress, from AOC and Bernie Sanders in the squad to the House Progressive Caucus. And the only no votes were about 60 House Republicans, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, and about 10 or 11, including Josh Hawley and Mike Lee in the Senate. All Republicans voted no. The only no votes came from Republicans, but overwhelmingly the establishment wings of both parties united as they always do to support it. And when Marjorie Taylor Greene rose in the House to explain why she was voting no, here's what she said.
Thank you. I rise in opposition to the Ukrainian supplemental bill. $40 billion, but there's no baby formula for American mothers and babies. An unknown amount of money to the CIA in the Ukraine supplemental bill, but there's no formula for American babies and mothers. $54 million in COVID spending in Ukraine, but there's no formula for American babies and mothers. $900 million for nonprofits and organizations in Ukraine, but there's no formula for American babies and mothers. $8.7 billion for economic support and funding in Ukraine, but there's no formula for American mothers.
So she chose the lack of formula for women who were facing a supply chain crisis, but also a resource crisis, and not being able to have the government help them obtain baby formula. And she was asking, I think quite reasonably, why are we sending $100 billion to Ukraine when mothers in the United States, American women, don't have access to baby formula? Just like Norman Finkelstein said, why, if I can't even have service, public service, for the Medicare that I earned as a senior, are we spending $100 billion in Ukraine? Why are we sending $100 billion to Zelensky, the CIA, and Raytheon? All very good questions. And you can pick any number of metrics that show the decline of the quality of life for American citizens who could definitely use that $100 billion in all sorts of ways. So here from KFF Health News is a report from March of last year entitled, quote, "Desperate for Cash, Programs for People with Disabilities Still Not Seeing Federal Funds." So we have a ton of disabled people in the United States. They can't work. They're certified as disabled. They cannot get the minimum payments to have a minimum quality of life from the government because the government can't get money to them while it sends $100 billion to Kiev. Here from the CDC in August of last year, there you see the headline from our own government. Life expectancy in the United States dropped for the second year in a row in 2021, and they have charts here that say life expectancy at birth in the United States declined nearly a year from 2020 to 2021, according to new provisional data from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics. That decline, 77.0 to 76.1 years, took U.S. life expectancy at birth to its lowest level since 1996. The 0.9 year drop in life expectancy in 2021, along with a 1.8 year drop in 2020, was the biggest 2-year decline in life expectancy since 1921 to 1923. Life expectancy at birth for women in the United States dropped 0.8 years from 79.9 years in 2020 to 79.1 in 2021, while life expectancy for men dropped 1 full year from 74.2 years in 2020 to 73.2 in 2021. The report shows the disparity in life expectancy between men and women grew in 2021 from 5.7 years in 2020 to 5.9 years in 2021, meaning women live longer than men by 6 years in the United States. From 2000 to 2010, this disparity had narrowed to 4.8 years, but gradually increased from 2010 to 2019 and is now the largest gap since 1996. Obviously, COVID played a role in the decline of life expectancy, but not anywhere near the only role. We're not supposed to have a declining life expectancy in a developed country. Our life expectancy is supposed to increase. Declining life expectancy signifies that our quality of life is degrading, which is why any rational person would be asking with anger why we're sending tens of billions of dollars after tens of billions of dollars to a war to determine who rules certain provinces in eastern Ukraine. That's ostensibly what the war is about, when the actual impact of the war is to enrich a tiny sliver of the American public at everyone else's expense. Here from the Pew Research Center in September 2020 is some greater digging into these life expectancy numbers. Oh no, this is actually about how, quote, a majority of young adults in the United States live with their parents for the first time since the Great Depression. There you see the article. It says, quote, the share of 18 to 29-year-olds living with their parents has become a majority since U.S. coronavirus cases began spreading early this year. A majority of people under 30 are living with their parents, surpassing the previous peak during the Great Depression era. In July, 52% of young adults resided with one or both of their parents, up from 47% in February, according to a new Pew Research Center analysis of monthly Census Bureau data. The number living with parents grew to 26.6 million, an increase of 2.6 million from February. The number and share of young adults living with their parents grew across the board for all major racial and ethnic groups, men and women, and metropolitan and rural residents, as well as in all 4 main census regions. Growth was sharpest for the youngest adults, ages 18 to 24, and for white young adults. The share of young adults living with their parents is higher than in any previous measurement, based on current surveys and decennial censuses. Before 2020, the highest measure value was in the 1940 census, at the end of the Great Depression, when 48% of young adults lived with their parents. So again, you can look at every metric. I just want to look at this Pew data survey from 2022, so 2 years later, to show that it is not dependent entirely on the COVID pandemic at all. Quote, Americans more likely to say it's a bad thing than a good thing that more young adults live with their parents. In other words, maybe young people, some want to choose to stay with their families because those kinds of family connections can be healthy and positive. But in general, especially for young men under 30, leaving the home and making your way in the world is a rite of passage to adulthood, and yet, for economic reasons, young American adults are impeded from doing so. Quote, in July 2022, Half of adults ages 18 to 29 were living with one or both of their parents. This was down from a recent peak of 52% in June 2020, but still significantly higher than the share who were living with their parents in 2010, 44% on average that year, or in 2000, 38% on average. Here's why it's hard to clean. So that is, again, a pretty significant decline. And if you're somebody who is stuck at home because you can't get a job that pays a livable wage to allow you even to rent an apartment, with real estate prices skyrocketing because hedge funds like BlackRock and capitalist funds are buying up enormous amounts of real estate in order to drive prices up, and you see $100 billion going out the window to Zelensky, to Ukraine, which months earlier you couldn't even place on a map, is there any wonder why people are going to be angry with our elite class? Here is a report from NPR last month, March 3rd, on the train explosion in East Palestine. Quote, here's why it's hard to clean up toxic waste from the East Palestine train derailment. The people in that region are still living with the toxic effects of those chemicals that our government have not been able to clean up. Quote, it's been nearly a month since a Norfolk Southern train derailed and spilled hundreds of thousands of pounds of toxic chemicals into the air, soil, and water around East Palestine, Ohio. In the week since, authorities have undertaken a massive operation to clean up the hazardous materials. The effort to remove vast amounts of contaminated soil and water from the small town in eastern Ohio has involved at least seven different licensed hazardous waste disposal facilities across 4 states: Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Texas. The tangle became even more complicated when the EPA enacted a one-day pause on Norfolk Southern's removal operations last weekend after officials in Texas and Mexico and Michigan raised concerns about East Palestine's waste coming to disposal facilities in their states. Afterwards, officials announced several new disposal sites for the East Palestine waste, including a landfill in Indiana, which prompted yet another objection from another state official, Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb. Quote, the material should go to the nearest facilities, not move from the far eastern side of Ohio to the far western side of Indiana, he said. Officials say they are searching for other disposal sites. The controversy underscores the complexities of a cleanup process that officials are undertaking as quickly as possible. Experts warn that it will likely take years to complete the cleanup of East Palestine, if it can be considered truly complete ever. Quote, they'll be living with this both environmentally and psychologically for a long time, and I don't see any real quick return to normal, said Noah Sachs, a professor of environmental law at the University of Richmond. You could spend all night, and we probably should at some point, highlighting and documenting and detailing the decline in the standard of living for American citizens, the complete collapse of a middle-class infrastructure, and the lack of resources that the government has or society has in order to give people a minimally decent and comfortable way of life, to allow them to leave home, to start a family, to take care of their children. All of these things Americans are economically deprived from doing in a way that they haven't been since at least the Great Depression. Now, oftentimes, defenders of militarism and war who know that this is their Achilles heel, it's very difficult to convince Americans that they should rise up against war because it's killing people on the other side of the world. Unless it's something like Vietnam, where Americans are being drafted in huge numbers, the way Ukrainian men are now being drafted, and often forced to go fight in a war on the other side of the world against their will. It's very difficult to get Americans to be invested enough in wars on the other side of the world, especially if you don't show them our victims, which is usually what happens in bombing campaigns and the like. If you compare the amount of media coverage given to the victims in Ukraine caused by the Russian military to the amount of media coverage given to the victims of the American military in our bombing campaigns and invasions, you will see this huge gap, because our media and our Washington know that as long as you hide the victims, Americans won't really mind. The time they will start to mind is when they realize the huge amount of resources being poured in to these endless wars that don't impact their life in any positive way, but actually deprive them of the thing they want their government to do, which is facilitate a society that allows them to maintain a decent material level of life. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.